While the headlines focus on overwhelming power projection and the historic blows dealt to regional adversaries, the real moves are happening in the quiet, unglamorous rooms of international diplomacy. The story repeated on cable news tonight suggests a clean, unambiguous victory, a narrative where a dangerous regime was effectively neutralized through an exhibition of unmatched military dominance. Yet if we step away from the press conferences and look at the sequence of events with the cold, analytical lens of a historian or a game theorist, a much stranger and more complex reality emerges. We see a war that began with total victory rhetoric, the assassination of a head of state, and promises of systemic change, only to transition months later into a negotiated memorandum that reads remarkably like a settlement between equals. The conversation has quietly narrowed down to shipping lanes, frozen bank accounts, and inspection rights, which happens to be almost exactly the menu of issues that was on the table before a single bomb fell. This is the true geopolitical chess game, a puzzle not of who is right or who is the good guy, but of mechanics, leverage, and the subtle shifting of global power dynamics. To properly unpack this, we must stretch our perspective beyond the immediate horizon of the daily news cycle and analyze the profound structural factors that dictate how modern states interact under extreme pressure. To understand how we arrived at this point, we must look at the timeline as a cohesive piece of evidence rather than the fragmented reports that filter through mainstream media. The opening phase of this conflict involved heavily coordinated airstrikes, an operation designed not as a limited engagement, but as the framework for a substantial confrontation. The immediate loss of top leadership, including senior commanders and key diplomatic figures who had been working on external off-ramps, appeared to signal a decisive shift. However, the subsequent response demonstrated the profound difference between tactical success and strategic control. The rapid disruption of commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, where a fifth of the world's petroleum physically flows, caused traffic to collapse almost instantly, sending economic ripples across the globe and forcing fuel rationing in distant energy-dependent markets. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a demonstration of structural leverage, showing that a motivated actor could reach directly into the global economic architecture and apply precise pressure. When a state demonstrates that it can freeze international shipping lanes overnight, it fundamentally alters the calculation of every major power that relies on the predictable flow of global trade. This dynamic aligns closely with a recurring historical pattern that we can call the entrapment dynamic, a phenomenon where a smaller, highly committed player manages to pull a larger, more powerful, but ultimately more ambivalent partner into a conflict the larger power did not actively seek. The classic template for this is the Bay of Pigs operational framework in 1961, where strategic planners pushed forward with an intervention that had little chance of succeeding on its own merits, under the assumption that once the crisis escalated, the patron state would feel politically compelled to commit full military force to avoid a humiliating retreat. In the modern context, we see a smaller regional power that has long sought a definitive external confrontation with its chief rival, operating alongside a larger power whose internal intelligence and military leadership harbor deep reservations about the long-term efficacy of the operation. Air power alone, regardless of its sophistication, historically fails to dismantle a regime without a massive, sustained ground commitment, an option that policymakers in Washington were deeply reluctant to pursue given the long, painful memories of previous multi-decade engagements in the region. The entrapment occurs because once the opening strikes are delivered, the larger power cannot easily withdraw without signaling weakness to the entire global audience, creating a scenario where the patron becomes a hostage to the strategic designs of its client. To deepen our understanding of this systemic dynamic, we must realize that entrapment is not a modern invention. It is one of the oldest structural vulnerabilities in the history of grand strategy. We saw it during the buildup to the First World War, where the rigid alliance systems of Europe meant that the actions of a smaller, highly radicalized actor in the Balkans could systematically drag the world's greatest empires into a total war that none of their top leadership truly wanted or fully anticipated. When a smaller state successfully creates a scenario where its own survival or its own political ambitions are tethered directly to the prestige of a global superpower, the superpower loses its strategic autonomy. The moment the first cruise missiles are launched and the first high-value targets are neutralized, the psychological trap closes. To pause the operation at that stage is branded by domestic opposition as an act of cowardice, while to escalate requires a commitment of ground forces that the national economy cannot realistically sustain. Therefore, the superpower finds itself trapped in a middle ground, expending vast amounts of military assets to maintain a holding pattern, while the smaller client state drives the geopolitical agenda from behind the scenes. Beyond the military and political mechanics, the second major factor dictating the outcome of modern conflicts is purely economic. Wars are won or lost as much on national balance sheets as they are on battlefields, and the actor less capable of absorbing prolonged financial disruption is inevitably the first to seek an exit. While tactical footage captures the public's attention, the reality of global trade is that the party controlling a vital maritime choke point does not need to win conventional engagements to exact an unsustainable toll on its opponents. When shipping lanes contract and energy markets face severe volatility, the pressure shifts immediately to political leaders who must answer to domestic electorates highly sensitive to inflation, rising fuel costs, and jittery financial markets. When a head of state explicitly notes the desire to avoid an economic catastrophe of historic proportions, it indicates that the financial advisors have presented data showing that the costs of continuation far outweigh the political benefits of total victory. This is the modern equivalent of the 1973 oil shock, a reminder that structural economic exposure can reshape foreign policy far more rapidly than conventional firepower. The modern globalized economy operates on highly sensitive supply chains, and any protracted disruption acts as an immediate tax on everyday consumers, generating immense domestic political pressure that no democratic administration can ignore for long. To fully grasp the magnitude of this economic leverage, one must look at the highly sensitive architecture of the modern maritime insurance and freight industries. When conflict erupts in a critical channel like the Strait of Hormuz, the cost of waging war is not merely borne by the state militaries involved, it is immediately absorbed by global commercial entities. War risk insurance premiums for maritime vessels spike exponentially within 48 hours of an initial strike. Shipping conglomerates, managing vast fleets of container ships and supertankers, refuse to risk their multi-million-dollar assets in contested waters, diverting their routes around entire continents. This diversion adds weeks to transit times and costs billions of dollars in additional fuel and labor, creating an immediate inflationary shock that reverberates through supermarket shelves, manufacturing hubs, and energy grids thousands of miles away. A superpower may possess the technical capability to locate and strike missile batteries from high altitudes, but it cannot force a commercial shipping line to sail into a zone where a single low-cost naval mine can sink a vessel and trigger a global corporate crisis. The real battlefield, therefore, shifts from the physical terrain of the Middle East to the global bond markets, where fluctuating commodity prices dictate the true boundaries of military ambition. The third critical dimension of this conflict involves the fragile architecture of alliances and regional reputations, a dynamic heavily reminiscent of the Suez Crisis of 1956. During that historical episode, a coordinated military intervention proceeded successfully on the ground, yet collapsed entirely due to external financial and political pressures, fundamentally altering how regional partners viewed the long-term reliability of traditional security guarantees. In the current landscape, smaller states that have spent decades anchoring their national security to an external superpower umbrella found their own territories, waters, and trade routes directly exposed to retaliation during the height of the hostilities. Watching a global superpower engage in months of intense operations only to ultimately enter into technical negotiations over tolls and frozen assets with the very government it sought to transform forces these regional partners to make a cold calculation. They must quietly evaluate whether the security architecture they have paid for in access, basing rights, and political loyalty remains viable, or whether prudence demands they begin establishing direct, independent channels of communication with their immediate neighbors. When confidence in a global guarantor cracks, the local actors begin hedging their bets, initiating quiet intelligence shares and trade talks with the very actors they previously viewed as existential threats. This process of strategic realignment among regional partners deserves closer examination because it fundamentally alters the balance of power for generations. When a security guarantor fails to achieve a clean, decisive resolution, it sends a clear signal to every middle power in the region that they are ultimately on their own. In the aftermath of such conflicts, we observe a distinct shift toward hyper-realism in regional diplomacy. Traditional alignments based on long-standing ideological or political treaties begin to dissolve. Wealthy regional states, realizing that a superpower umbrella cannot fully protect their critical infrastructure from asymmetric saturation strikes, begin investing heavily in their own defensive capabilities while simultaneously engaging in quiet, transactional diplomacy with their adversaries. This is not driven by a sudden desire for peace, but by an absolute necessity for survival. They recognize that a negotiated settlement that protects their economic assets is vastly superior to a prolonged conflict that leaves their industrial sectors devastated, regardless of who claims victory at a podium in a distant capital. This divergence between operational realities and public messaging creates what can be termed the narrative gap, the deliberate space maintained between what a conflict actually achieved and what political leaders are willing to say out loud to domestic audiences. Every long, inconclusive confrontation produces its own specialized vocabulary designed to save face and manage perceptions. Historically, major powers do not announce that an intervention has failed to yield its original objectives at an acceptable price. Instead, they introduce concepts of phased transitions, strategic patience, or localized responsibility, framing an exit as an orderly evolution rather than an acknowledgement of exhaustion. We are seeing that exact linguistic drift take place today, as the sweeping rhetoric of comprehensive regional transformation and institutional collapse has quietly been replaced by highly technical discussions regarding maritime access, inspection protocols, and asset management. The goalposts are moved so gradually and quietly that by the time the shift is noticeable, the original grander promises have been entirely removed from the active political discourse. This rhetorical contraction is a universal feature of statecraft, acting as a buffer against domestic political blowback while the state adjusts its commitments to align with its actual material limitations. To contextualize this narrative management, we can observe how historic empires utilized elaborate public rituals and monuments to mask the reality of strategic retreats. When the Roman Empire under Emperor Hadrian decided to abandon the territorial conquests of his predecessor Trajan in Mesopotamia, the official imperial pronouncements did not describe the move as a withdrawal forced by unsustainable logistics and relentless local insurrections. Instead, the administrative language reframed the retreat as a calculated act of imperial moderation and stabilization designed to solidify the existing borders for the long-term health of the state. In the modern era, the media landscape has changed, but the psychological imperative remains identical. A contemporary administration facing an inconclusive military outcome will systematically reduce the scope of its public vocabulary. It will cease speaking of systemic political overhauls and begin emphasizing the stabilization of global commerce, the enforcement of narrow regulatory frameworks, and the success of localized containment strategies, allowing the public to lose interest while the technical teams negotiate the terms of an off-ramp. When we synthesize these four lenses, entrapment dynamics, economic exposure, alliance reputation, and the narrative gap, the current state of affairs stops looking like a paradox and begins to look like an entirely predictable outcome. It reveals the complex reality of modern geopolitics, where a smaller, highly motivated actor can leverage geographical advantages and economic vulnerabilities to neutralize the sheer material superiority of a global superpower. We must remain intellectually cautious and avoid confusing the loudness of a victory declaration with the actual attainment of strategic goals, as all leaders will naturally describe any negotiated outcome as a validation of their original policies. Looking forward, the situation remains fluid, and the fragile framework currently being negotiated in international summits faces numerous domestic and regional pressures that could easily cause it to fracture before late summer. Ultimately, to understand where this trajectory leads, we must ignore the sensationalized headlines and watch the variables that truly dictate the behavior of nations, the stability of shipping lanes, the shifting diplomatic alignments of regional powers, and the precise vocabulary used by statesmen to describe the limits of their power. To expand our understanding of this strategic stalemate, we must also consider the hidden role of secondary regional powers and non-state networks that act as force multipliers. A superpower often calculates its military equations under the assumption of a closed ecosystem, believing that striking primary nodes will cause the entire network to disintegrate. In reality, modern asymmetric conflict functions much like a decentralized web. When the centralized leadership in Tehran faced direct kinetic strikes, the operational burden shifted instantly to pre-coordinated autonomous cells throughout the regional theater. These cells did not require direct command verification to begin mining shipping lanes, targeting secondary logistics hubs, or launching low-cost drone arrays that forced the deployment of incredibly expensive air defense interceptors. This disparity in the cost of warfare is a critical vulnerability for any advanced military. Spending millions of dollars per missile to intercept drones that cost only a few $1,000s creates a negative material burn rate that cannot be sustained indefinitely. It is this economic asymmetry on the battlefield, combined with the wider energy shock, that created the quiet urgency within Western financial capitals to find a diplomatic off-ramp, despite the confident rhetoric being displayed on television screens across the globe. Furthermore, we must examine the internal political friction within the major capitals themselves. In Washington, foreign policy is rarely a singular, monolithic consensus. It is a battleground between competing factions with vastly different priorities. The military and intelligence establishments often find themselves at odds with economic advisors and electoral strategists who view international entanglements through the lens of domestic stability. As the conflict entered its second and third months, the domestic cost of living indexes began reflecting the strain of the maritime blockade, triggering alarm bells within political circles facing upcoming electoral cycles. When the risk of domestic inflation starts threatening the political survival of an administration, the grand strategic objectives of regional regime change are quickly abandoned in favor of immediate crisis containment. This explains why the American diplomatic team in Doha began quietly signaling flexibility on long-standing sanctions and frozen assets, seeking any viable mechanism to restore normalcy to the global energy markets before the economic damage became politically irreversible at home. The reaction of the broader international community, particularly major consuming nations in Asia, also played a decisive, quiet role in forcing the current compromise. Nations that rely heavily on the unhindered flow of energy through the Middle East did not simply sit by as passive spectators. They applied immense diplomatic pressure behind the scenes. For these industrial economies, a prolonged disruption to the oil supply translates directly to industrial slowdowns, unemployment, and severe social unrest. Consequently, they utilized their substantial financial leverage and holdings of Western debt to signal that a continued escalation would have severe consequences for international financial stability. This global interdependence means that a conflict in the Middle East is never truly localized. It is tethered to the global financial system, allowing neutral third parties to exercise an effective veto over the escalatory options available to a superpower. The memorandum being drafted in Doha is therefore not just a bilateral agreement between two adversaries, but a reflection of a global demand for stability that overrode the initial aggressive geopolitical ambitions of the combatants. Looking deeper into the historical precedents, the current situation mirrors the broader pattern of how empires reach the limits of their power when confronted by geography and asymmetric resolve. When Rome attempted to expand its borders past the Danube or the Euphrates, it frequently achieved massive tactical victories, burning enemy capitals and declaring absolute triumph to the Senate. Yet the high cost of maintaining those distant borders, coupled with the relentless hit-and-run tactics of localized resistance, routinely forced the empire to quietly negotiate treaties that returned the frontier to its original status quo. The modern system operates under different names and technologies, but the underlying arithmetic of power remains entirely unchanged. Material abundance and technological supremacy can win any opening battle, but they cannot alter the fundamental reality that a highly motivated local actor, operating on its own home terrain, will always possess a higher tolerance for pain and a longer strategic horizon than an external power managing a multitude of global commitments. We must also critically analyze the structural limitations of modern intelligence gatherers and military planners who fall victim to their own technological hubris. In the build-up to advanced kinetic operations, reliance on satellite imagery, electronic intercepts, and mathematical models creates an illusion of complete visibility. Planners believe they can map every command bunker, every supply line, and every underground silo, leading to the conclusion that a swift, overwhelming decapitation strike will paralyze the targeted state institutional framework. What these models consistently fail to account for is the chaotic variable of human agency and cultural resilience. When a society is operated under the pressure of severe international sanctions and existential isolation for multiple decades, its infrastructure adapts to survive the very scenario of a total air campaign. Redundant systems are constructed deep within mountainous terrain. Communication networks are intentionally downgraded to low-tech, non-interceptable formats, and the civilian population develops a psychological callosity to hardship. Consequently, when the shock and awe campaign is unleashed, it achieves immediate destruction of physical assets, but fails to break the political will of the state, leaving the attacking superpower with no viable follow-up option other than a full-scale occupation that it cannot politically or logistically afford. As we look toward the future, the primary question is whether the current memorandum of understanding represents a genuine long-term stabilization or merely a temporary operational pause before the next inevitable flare-up. The underlying drivers of the conflict, the regional competition for dominance, the unresolved nuclear question, and the deep systemic mistrust between the participating capitals remain entirely unaddressed by the current diplomatic text. What we are witnessing is not the resolution of a crisis, but the management of its symptoms, driven by a mutual exhaustion and a shared recognition that further escalation carries an unacceptable price tag. The actors have simply agreed to step back from the precipice, return to the familiar baseline of economic negotiations, and regroup for the next phase of their protracted competition. For the global observer, the lesson is clear. True power in the modern era is not measured by the ability to launch devastating strikes, but by the capacity to endure the economic and political fallout of those actions over time. Ultimately, this entire episode serves as a profound reality check for the limits of modern military intervention in an interconnected world. The grand strategies designed in think tanks and presented in brightly lit press rooms inevitably collide with the friction of real-world logistics, economic dependencies, and the unyielding resolve of local populations. The narrative of total victory is a luxury reserved for domestic consumption, a political necessity to justify the massive expenditure of blood and treasure to an increasingly skeptical public. But in the quiet corridors of power, where the real decisions are made, the rhetoric is stripped away, leaving only the cold, hard calculations of survival, leverage, and cost. To navigate the complex geopolitical landscape of the coming decades, we must train ourselves to ignore the theater of public pronouncements and look steadily at the underlying structural realities that truly govern the behavior of empires. Keep these dynamics in mind the next time you hear a swift and decisive victory proclaimed from a political podium, and remember that in the grand chessboard of global politics, the game is never truly over, and the most consequential moves are almost always the ones that happen in the dark.